can't deny the fact that you like me. Right now, you like me. Thank you.
No introduction, no context needed for that one, right? No, I was. As we've been talking about the last several weeks, we're doing this series called The Deeply Formed Life, and this morning we are beginning to look at self-examination. Now, what does that have to do with you like me, you really like me? Well, a couple things. We're going to come back to that later, but one of the things that strikes me about that particular little clip, I mean, that took all of, I think beginning to end, that clip is 19 seconds. The part that everybody knows is about 4 seconds. It's really fast. But if you are of a certain age and you say, you like me, you really like me, everybody knows immediately what you're talking about, or they think they do. It's become kind of a cultural, we make fun of it. It's a little bit lampooned. But if you look at the wider context of what happened on that evening in 1985 when Sally Field won her second Oscar, you would know that we're not being very fair to dear Sally, because prior to that sentence, which is lifted out of context and made to seem like a very self-serving kind of statement, you will find that right before this, as she's accepting this Oscar, she's talking about how when she won her first Oscar several years before, she didn't really appreciate it. And she didn't really believe that it was real in a sense, and it didn't sink in because she didn't believe in her own work. And that her own early work was what we would call non-critical. I mean, cinematic masterpieces like Smokey and the Bandit, or earlier than that, The Flying Nun, right? So when she wins an Oscar, she's like, I'm not sure I'm worthy of this. And then when she wins the second one, it starts to sink in that people really do appreciate her work. And unfortunately, it's become this kind of cultural joke, right? But that sense of context and that sense of really understanding where you stand is important. Self-examination is what we're going to talk about for the next 2 Sundays in this series. So this morning we're going to begin that, and then in 2 weeks we'll pick it up again. But Rich Viodas says that the goal of self-examination is freedom. Freedom from destructive thought patterns, inner messages, and the ways we wrongly perceive things. Freedom from destructive thought patterns, inner messages, and the ways we wrongly perceive things. And I would add, freedom from sin. Because all of those things, in some way or another, are either the direct result of sin or, are sin themselves. But before we get to those practices of self-examination, it struck me that while this is a very long and rich tradition in not only the Christian faith, but also the Jewish faith, of self-examination and understanding who we are before God, it struck me that there's a word that we need to hear so that work can be done well and truly. You see, there's a very long tradition of that examination, and what we're really talking about there when we examine ourselves is, in some sense, sin. And sin means I am not okay, you are not okay, we are not okay. Right? I mean, I know for when I was growing up, that was the big thing, right? I'm okay, you're okay. But what sin means, and the result of sin, is that none of us are okay, and we collectively together are not okay. We need healing. We need restoration. We need grace. We need to experience those things. But the challenge to experiencing those things is difficult for a number of reasons. One of those reasons is that we find ourselves in the United States in our Western expression of Christianity of a long history of understanding God to be filled with wrath and anger at us. In fact, if you go back in American history, one of the examples of American preaching and American theology that you will read is Jonathan Edwards' sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Right? Now, if you're not familiar with this sermon, Google it. You can pull it up. It's some intense reading. And the story goes that Jonathan Edwards, when he preached this sermon, and it began one of the big revivals in the Eastern United States back in the colonial times, that he simply stood and read that sermon monotone to his congregation. And let me just say that this sermon is exactly what the title sounds like. Sinners in the hands of an angry God. God is angry and he needs to be satisfied and placated and that's why. And he's angry at our sin, and it needs to be moved or taken away. But here's the thing, and we bounced off this a couple times, flat out did a whole sermon on it a while back. Our understanding as covenant people, as people who are a part of the Evangelical Covenant Church, one of our founding principles of theology is atonement theology, and that is that God's motivating factor for redeeming us, for sending Jesus, was not wrath, but was love. That God's primary disposition towards us is love, not wrath. And so we come from a tradition where sinners in the hands of an angry God does not resonate, because we understand that God's love is what motivates him to redeem us and to set all things right, ultimately. But we live in the context of this tradition of Christianity in the West where you hear a lot about God's wrath and God's anger and how God doesn't really like you, right? And so in order for us to engage this work of self-examination and to understand what God needs to do in us, we have to understand God's character. We have to understand who God is. And so if we look at this psalm, and we're just going to look at the first part of this psalm this morning, and then we'll pick it up when we do the second part of this the next piece in this series in 2 weeks. Verses 1 through 4 in Psalm 139 say, "You have searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you, Lord, know it completely." So there's a couple things that we can learn in these 4 verses of this psalm. The first is that God is relational. God is in relationship to us. He knows us. And he doesn't just know some of us, he knows all of us. He knows all of it, right? He knows our emotions. He knows our sin. He knows our brokenness. He knows where we fall short. He knows what makes us joyful. He knows what makes us sad. He knows all of it. So here's the thing, and this is a lesson that is hard for especially those of us who grew up in the church. And it seems really rudimental, seems really basic, right? We'll get there. But the reality is that I hear and I have heard as a pastor over my career, people just don't get this. And it's quite simple. Are you ready? You can't hide from God. It doesn't matter what you think you're hiding, and it doesn't matter how you think you're hiding it. Whether it's some deep, dark sin and brokenness, some habit, some thing that you're entrapped in, that you're addicted to, or whatever, you can hide it and dress it up and do all kinds of things. God knows, right? Now that's the easy part. Here comes the hard part. The hard part is that when we pretend that we're not angry, or we pretend that it's fine, it's just fine, God knows. And somehow we think that God can't handle it. And yet this psalm tells us that God knows all of it. But we like to pretend somehow that he doesn't, that we can hide it from him. N.T. Wright, the great New Testament theologian, says this. He says that all our hidden motives and fears are like an open book before him. He knows where they came from, and he understands what they are doing to us and what we are doing with them. Right? God sees it all. And then there's these words of what seem to be comfort in verses 5 and 6, where the psalmist says, "You hem me in behind and before, you lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence?" Here's an interesting thing. In verse 5, when it says, "You hem me in behind and before," the actual, a more literal translation to that might be, the word that's used there it means enclose, but it also means siege or besiege. In other words, in a sense, you could read that and hear it as God laying siege to you and to who you are and to knowing everything about you. Now, there is a sense where that can be very calming and very, make you feel at peace. But for a lot of people, maybe the response isn't that. You could hear verse 7, "Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence?" Not as comfort, but as despair. Because if we have spent a lifetime hiding because God is angry, knowing that God knows us, and that if we try to run, as the next verses describe, that God will be there, that's not necessarily comforting. Which is why it's so important for us to understand the nature and the character of God, as the psalmist clearly does. Because while the psalmist very clearly says that no matter where he goes, if he goes to the heights, if he goes to the depths, if he goes to the dark, it doesn't matter, God is there. Our natural response or inclination might be to flee being known in that way, right? I mean, think about your most intimate relationships as you're just starting out, or maybe you've been in them for a long time, but you're what would be called emotionally unavailable. Part of what freaks you out is that being known. And when you start to feel known, you start to run, right? Because you're not trusting your beloved. And so if we think about what it means to do self-examination, we need to understand who God is. And that presence is not threatening, but healing. So I want you to think of the story of the woman at the well from John 4. We're not going to read the text. But the story of the woman at the well in John 4, if you've been around, you're familiar with it. The thumbnail sketch of it is this. There's a woman who comes to the well at midday in Samaria. The disciples have gone into town to get food and supplies, and Jesus is sitting at the well, and this Samaritan woman comes, and Jesus engages her. And they have this conversation, and Jesus sees her, and Jesus knows her. And her response is not fear, but joy, right? Because what happens, it says, is she leaves her water jar after this interchange with Jesus, who basically says, yeah, the guy you're living with now, not your husband. You've had several. Things are not going well for you. And he calls her out on that, and he has this conversation with her, and her response is to leave her water jar, go back into town, and say to the people, "Come see a man who told me everything I ever did." Could this be the Messiah? That is not a response to wrath. That is not a response to anger. That is a response to love, overwhelming love. And that is God's posture towards us. Another example further on in the Gospel of John. Chapter 14, verse 8 and 9 reads, "Philip said, 'Lord, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us.'" I love this text. Right? Because this is towards the end of Jesus' ministry. Jesus has done miracles. Jesus has walked on the water. Jesus has risen Lazarus from the dead. Jesus has done all kinds of stuff. I mean, he has been demonstrating the presence of the kingdom of God. And Philip says, if you just show us the Father, that'd be enough. Couldn't need any more. And Jesus says, "Don't you know me, Philip? Even after I have been among you such a long time, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father." So friends, what I want for us to think about as we enter into these two passages and think about what it means to do self-examination and to look at the hard places, the broken places in our life, is to recognize that when we get afraid, when we have fear about being honest with where we find ourselves, about the sin in our lives, about the brokenness in our hearts, about the brokenness in our families, that we think of God not as filled with wrath, but we look into the eyes of Jesus, who demonstrates God's overwhelming, unrelenting love for us. And then we allow that love to overwhelm us, that we might say with the psalmist, it doesn't matter where I can go to the heights, I can go to the depths, it doesn't matter how depressed I am, it doesn't matter how many times I've fallen into this trap, it doesn't matter how many times I have experienced this brokenness. God looks at me with the eyes of Jesus. And he sees my brokenness, and he wraps his arms around me, and he welcomes me home. Friends, that love is for you, no matter where you find yourselves, no matter what your experience of life has been, no matter how thin the thread that you are grasping to believe that God actually could love you. Look into the eyes of Jesus. See the welcome there. See the love there. And come home. Amen.